Hey, everybody. Nice to see you. It is time for the Bronx Buzz. This is BronxNet's program where we talk to reporters, writers, editors, journalists, anybody who is writing stuff so you can get the inside and find out what's going on. That's the buzz. And in our second segment today, you're going to love it. It's an environmentalist, but he's really an artist. I'm not sure which is first. I think he's probably an artist first and then became an environmentalist. And he creates some of the most important creations that you will ever see. And he has some real interesting perspectives. But let's get started right now with the senior staff writer at the Bronx Times. It is my friend, Robbie Sequeria. Nice to see you, Robbie.
Pleasure to be on here as always, Gary.
Robbie, as I told you beforehand, you're just doing a great job. Excuse me. There's so much that you're working on, and what you're. I hope people will check out the Bronx Times and read Robbie's work because they're doing great. Let's just start with this. I thought this was ironic, given all the stuff that Alyssa and you and the people at the paper have been talking about. Is the Fortune Society? This is your headline. Scrapped a planned men's reentry facility in Morrisania. So people in the East Bronx have got to be saying, well, wait a minute. They did it because they didn't like the community response to the idea. And then the proposal at Jacobi Medical Center, the Just Home proposal, is they're saying, well, why not us? Is that a fair question? I mean, what do you make of all this?
Yeah, well, it's interesting.
It's hard not to ask that question.
I can understand where there are maybe hurt feelings aside. I think for this project, it's important to understand that this district, so Community District 3, they have a lot of shelters and transitional living facilities in their district. We've done a couple of math, and I believe it's there's a 4 community district area that involves this district where there's 63 temporary living facilities within 21 square miles. So there's been a lot of issues with, hey, we already have enough of these shelters, and really what we want is affordable housing or permanent housing at least. And these arguments aren't, I think they're different than the Just Home arguments, because the Just Home arguments were kind of more, we don't want X amount of people here in this district. Whereas this is we have way too many of these type of shelters.
So then the question, which is a little esoteric and outside of really the bounds of what you've written about, then the ultimate question is saturation, whether or not, and then that leads to the political question of, does every district have to have either equal amount or contribute to the solution to this problem?
I know that's something that the mayor has said many times, that, each district is going to kind of get they're going to have to get one eventually, particularly because the city has, high numbers of people who are homeless, particularly if you don't have eviction protections, people then become homeless. So, there's a lot of particular issues in terms of where you're going to house people. If you have districts that don't have some, you have districts that have way too many. The one thing that I think is really kind of, I think, a promising thing is that both the Fortune Society and the community board members, they can't, I think part of politics and part of in the polarized climate is that both of these sides kind of saw each other's point of view, and they were able to go, hey, maybe we shouldn't have one here, but there wasn't kind of this kind of mudslinging or or at least kind of any type of narratives against the people who need this type of housing, which to me, I think is kind of more positive note that, the Fortune Society might be able to do business with this community district in the future.
I understand what you're saying. And I appreciate that, because some people might avoid that discussion. But if you really covered it like you have covered it, and Alyssa and everybody at the paper, then you'd have to, the only evaluation could be that the dialogue got pretty vile. I mean, what can I tell you? It really was, and especially in the Bronx, it's just hard to deny that, man, if you can't just accept all people of all types with all economic backgrounds or whatever, then boy, oh boy, I mean, it's anyway, let's move on. Here was something I thought that was interesting, was this whole elephant captivity bill. And of course, the residents of the Bronx, and they, I suppose, deserve rights like everybody else. The elephants have been longtime residents of the Bronx. I haven't looked it up, but probably longer than both of us. The elephants actually won, and now the Bronx Zoo has to deal with that, which is whether it's expensive, whether it's land. I'm
Mhm.
not even into that. What do you make of this whole thing that the Bronx politicians then came out? I don't want to say against the elephants, but in favor of the Bronx Zoo.
Yeah. This is, so I've been following this, goodness, probably since I started the Bronx Times. This was initially a high profile court case at the Court of Appeals, highest court in the land. And it was basically Happy Elephant was the kind of the subject of. There's two Bronx elephants at the zoo. And they were trying to kind of argue on half of habeas corpus, that, prevents against wrongful imprisonment on behalf of the elephant. So the Court of Appeals didn't exactly see it that way. And so Councilmember Shahana Hanif, she proposed this legislation that would stipulate an animal enclosure, which is there's got to be acre differences. There has to be,
Right.
they can't be in solitary because they're herd animals. And really, the politician response and in the Bronx Zoo's response really is that, number one, the Bronx Zoo has really been lauded for its conservation efforts. The alligators.
Well earned.
Yeah,
Well
the,
earned.
the, the alligators are a big example. They're,
Yes.
they haven't, in 2006, they decided not to, have more elephants. So there kind of is an argument that's like, well, these two elephants are going to be kind of living their last days here. And the Bronx Zoo is the organization that's, I guess, the most readily to accept them and keep them housed and keep them stable for the rest of their lives. And so there's kind of I think a solidarity moment amongst the Bronx that was like,
Right.
leave the elephants
Well,
alone.
I'm sure it would be a fascinating time to be sitting around the table with the people of the Wildlife Conservation Society when they sit around and say, "What do we do about this?" And it's not only with these, but are we never? I mean, the elephants in the Bronx Zoo is iconic for generations. I mean, every one of us remembers what it looks like. Just as an aside, I once did a show right in front of that elephant area, that historic area where the elephants are. And while we started the show, the guy was throwing out food so that the elephant would walk by and go back and forth. He was throwing out like bushels of carrots and whatever. Anyway, that's an aside. Here's another issue that is raging. We're just moving. Believe me, we could spend a lot of time on each one. This is raging throughout the Bronx. The Montefiore nurses went on strike and they got a settlement. I mean, there's still some question as to whether or not the settlement works and whether nurses will ultimately be happy. So you wrote about Jacobi Hospital seeing 20% of its nurses quit in 2022. And the bottom line here is the nursing shortage. And I must add that the nurses at Lincoln Hospital are saying, wait a minute, if they got that kind of solution at Montefiore, whoa, the job is no less or no more. Well, maybe it is more difficult down at Lincoln Hospital. I don't know. But, we do the same job. Why don't we get the same money?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Robbie, solve my problem.
Yeah. I mean, there's been, I would say that this city has seen a lot of labor movements in the past, year. I mean, it's, he says evergreen, but nursing has really been the big one. The year started off with private sector nurses striking and ultimately getting fair contracts out of that. And so for the public sector nurses, it's different because when their contract expires, it still is in place until a new one's negotiated. Particularly because losing those public sector nurses would lead to detrimental effects in healthcare. But there's also a $19,000 pay disparity between private sector nurses and public sector nurses. And public sector nurses are like, why are we not seeing that? There was a deal that was in place in the 1990s that the city reported first that talked about kind of this clause that was in place that kind of prevented them to be within the same pay scale as entry-level private sector nurses. And they want that eliminated too as well. So it's really interesting. In the interim, as a lot of these nurses have left, whether it's due to burnout, whether it's due to discrepancy in their pay, Jacobi's had to fill in with temporary nurses who do make about double or triple the salary of the nurses currently there, which is probably another.
So like, where are you saving your money?
Yeah,
what's the real savings here? Like,
and talking to like a temp nurse, you're talking to a temp nurse.
I'm going to let you finish, and I know what I want to say. Go ahead.
Yeah, talking to a temp nurse, they said it's a pretty unsustainable model if you're going to do it for more than say like a month or two to continue relying on temporary services. And Jacobi told me that they are really hoping to not have to rely on temporary nurses. But this is one of those issues that I think when it comes to the degree of difficulty, the degree of need that nurses are, as we've seen with the private sector nurses, when you lose that power, that workforce power, you're going to see a disruption in services.
And that workforce power comes from their motivation, because this is very difficult work. But if you love the work and you love the people and you think you're doing a good job, but if that breaks down through a contract negotiation, through work, and the nursing shortage is all over the place. What I just want to say is, nurses we have nothing if we don't have nurses. You look at the pandemic and look what they went through and what we went through. Without them, we have nothing. I'll tell you real quick, because we are running out of time. Years ago, Freddie Ferrer was on my program. He had been in the hospital. I asked him how he was doing, et cetera, et cetera. And his answer was, nurses, one thing I learned, nurses are the greatest people in the world. And we're really running out of time. But what I will say, to me, the solution in the Bronx to this is the Lehman College nursing building that's going up right next door to where BronxNet is located. We've got to just train more nurses. And then once we do that, I'll make this the last question. Is there a way to, whether it's legislation or something else, to create a base pay, or to create, is it a union thing? Is it a governmental thing? How do we make it? Because there's no reason the private nurses should make more or less, or anybody should make more. This is what the job is,
Yeah, I think
and everybody else socialism. So I don't know how to solve this problem.
I think it's with all industries. I know it's the same in my industry. You have to, I think, let your employers need to know how much the time spent is time done. And not only that, there's work that is done that is not exactly added into a salary, that I think especially nurses who do something for public health and public good can't be quantified. And particularly if they're taking over with a lot of things. So I think it comes to a point where we're just kind of finding out what these industries are dealing with and suffering, because we've had such a spotlight on the labor movement. And I think that the more that we see these industries come out, the more there's probably going to be something along the lines of, hey, this is what we should be getting paid, especially if you live in the most expensive city in the nation. I think that's going to be.
And listen, and the most difficult people coming in with stab wounds and gunshot wounds and illness, or not even that bad shape, but they need love and health care because they don't get it anywhere else. I mean, and you're dealing with the most personal of issues. I mean, what can I tell you? So I'm rooting for our nurses. That's all. I hope that they're satisfied. That's my own point of view. Listen, Robbie Sequeria from the Bronx Times, you're the best. There is never enough time. Maybe we should do a 3-hour show or podcast.
I would love to.
Because we'd never get out of the room. Listen, you're the best. And you're going to enjoy our next segment coming up right after this. We're going to visit with somebody who's going to educate all of us about a lot of very important things. So don't go away.